The story starts with a kid playing a strategy RPG on his PC, even while in the hospital. Out of nowhere, his body gets heavy, everything goes black, and his mind is sucked into an imaginary ocean. Until, suddenly, he wakes up in a forest, sitting all cool on a stone throne. And to complete the isekai combo, a woman approaches, speaking to him as if she'd been waiting for the handsome guy to wake up. When she steps out of the shadows, it hits the kid right away. It was none other than Atu Amacinta, an elf who called him king. The game he was playing in the hospital was a dark fantasy strategy simulator called Eternal Nations, and the character he loved most, the one standing right in front of him now, was this very elf. Now, he couldn't help but wonder, should he act like the king she claimed he was? It was clear she saw him as the leader of Minogra. Sensing his confusion, the girl smiles and says, "It's all right, Takuto." After all, he beat Nightmare difficulty using what was considered the hardest civilization in the game, the ruined civilization, Minogra. Because of that, Era Takuto became the legendary player at the very top of the global leaderboard. Atu, for her part, remembered every moment they played together, how they had conquered the world side by side time and again, so there was no need for him to worry, she knew exactly who he was. Thinking back, Takuto realized Atu matched his own playstyle, maybe because he'd always wanted to be as strong as she was. Tears welled up in his eyes as he admitted how happy he was to finally speak to his favorite character. She said she felt the same. Takuto asked if this was heaven, and if Atu was the one who'd brought him here, but she explained that she, too, had simply appeared in this place out of the blue, and it didn't seem much like paradise. If anything, she thought, it felt more like the world of Eternal Nations, no doubt about it. She said it was a miracle, and it was a true honor to meet her master in person. With that, the elf knelt before the boy, took his hand, and invited him to start again, just the two of them, building a kingdom of their own. As tempting as the offer was, Takuto was still lost in confusion. Even so, with his loyal companion by his side, maybe this was his chance to relive those golden days in this new world. So, Takuto called on his servant to begin their journey together. Au Amacinta introduced herself as the child born from the mud who will bring destruction to the world, declaring that, from now on, her body and mind belonged solely to her master. Hearing this over-the-top speech, Takuto cringed so hard he almost had a stroke. He realized that saying this stuff in real life is way harder than in the game, and Atu admitted it was a little embarrassing for her, too. Still, the king decided to play along, calling the elf his first and only subordinate, his confidant and right hand. Then Takuto asked if his servant knew what Minogra's first move should be, and in perfect sync, the two replied, "Let's go into hiding." Next, Takuto summons a scout using emergency production. Without delay, a creature known as a long-legged insect crawls out of a portal, a sight both Takuto and Atu found a bit gross, to be honest. Still, Takuto reminded himself that Minogra was a civilization of moderation that wielded evil and ruin, so they'd need to keep that in mind. For Atu, that meant they had to do everything possible to avoid revealing their true identities. First order from the king, he sent the insect to scout the area without being seen. Watching the bug scuttle off, Takuto realized he could see through its eyes. That summoning had cost him 100 mana, leaving him with 100 more. To set up the base, the operations sector, would cost another 20. Atu lays down the law that emergency production costs a ton of mana, so they should be careful with their spending. Takuto admitted he really wanted to create a warrior to defend them, but that would probably drain all his mana. Speaking of combat, the elf pledged to do her best, or at least, that's what she wanted to say, if she weren't so weak right now. Takuto understood. Atu was a hero unit who got stronger over time, but at the moment her strength was only 3, less than even some basic enemies. In short, their entire plan to build Minogra was at serious risk if they were attacked by pretty much anything. Using the scout's vision, Takuto surveyed the land around them, forest as far as the eye could see. So far, no monsters in sight. Au thought the forest was a perfect place to hide, but found it strange that the long-legged insect hadn't spotted a single animal along the way. Even worse, Takuto realized there was absolutely nothing to eat. All they could do was stay alert and hope something turned up. Atu apologized for not being more helpful, but the boy told her that just having her company was more than enough, making her eyes shine with joy. Seeing her so moved, he thought to himself how hard it had been to notice these little things in the game, but Atu's personality really was just like this. Putting that aside, through the scout's eyes, Takuto soon discovered a community of dark elves not far away. He explained that this type of elf tended to be neutral, maybe leaning a bit toward evil, which, honestly, was a relief. At the very least, it confirmed that they really were in the world of eternal nations. On the downside, if there was another civilization's settlement nearby, it could spell trouble. Avoiding war at the start of the game was crucial. So, their top priority was to find a safe place to settle, but before that, they needed to keep an eye on the Dark Elves and gather more information. If things went south, they'd just have to make a run for it. Suddenly, speak of the devil, a small group of Dark Elves appeared before the stone throne where Minogra's two companions sat. To them, our man Takuto was just a shadowy, sinister figure, a vision so terrifying it made their leader, Jia, break out in a cold sweat. Convinced he was witnessing the devil himself, incarnate, knowing his actions could decide the fate of his entire race, Jia composed himself and stepped forward. Bowing, he introduced his companions as members of the Mazeram clan. His own name was Jia Najeev, and he apologized for entering the forest without permission from what appeared to be the master of these lands. With a chilling expression, Atu recognized that this elf truly understood the gravity of trespassing here, but wanted to know the reason. Jia explained that their clan lived in Iragia, but they were persecuted and forced to flee into the forest. He tried to tell their whole story, but Atu pressed him to keep it brief, making Jia more and more anxious not to make a mistake that would put his people at risk. Amidst this, Takuto commented on how thin the Dark Elves looked, and Jia admitted, with a heavy heart, that they hadn't found any food there. The elf then wondered why his clan had to endure so much suffering, when all they wanted was a peaceful place to live. Out of nowhere, the supposed master of the shadowy forest offered him a handful of apples. Takuto mentioned that they taste delicious if you cut them into the shape of a rabbit. Jia had never seen fruit like this and wondered if it would be rude to try one on the spot. But the rest of his group was too hungry for such concerns. They bit into the apples and smiles spread across their faces. But that wasn't all. Takuto opened a portal and handed out pears as well. Jia bowed even lower, saying there were others like them, including small, starving children. So, instead of eating now, he asked for permission to take the fruit back to the others. Takuto listened, felt sorry for them, and handed over even more food, this time with bread and vegetables too. Witnessing what seemed like a miracle, Jia Najeev reflected on how the Dark Elves had always been despised. Marked by scorn, Jia's people were forced to live in the shadows, and no one had ever reached out to help them. Overwhelmed by such power and mercy, Najeev finally dared to ask, who was this individual sitting on the throne? Meanwhile, back at the Dark Elf settlement, those who hadn't traveled were doing their best to bear the hunger. Then, suddenly, the foraging party returned, their leader grinning from ear to ear with the best news possible. The famine was finally over. With all that food, joy swept through the whole village. Later, while the community slept, Najeev sat by a campfire. The old elder Multer came over to compliment the chief on his work. Multer said he'd lived a long life, but never had he seen such strange and delicious fruit. Najeev agreed. And that was exactly why the old man wanted to know what had led the clan to such circumstances. Ready to share the truth, Jia said he'd met a legendary being deep in the forest. According to legend, a being was sealed away in the cursed lands. Multer was stunned, wondering if the expedition had encountered the ruined king, a figure found in old books and stories. When the world reached its limit, the ruined king would appear, bringing devastation to all. As much as no one could say for sure, it was also impossible to say the legend was just a lie. Jia, for his part, never caught the being's name, but had to admit that the frightening appearance fit the title of Ruined King all too well. The entity was simply beyond comprehension, but at least he had a servant who could clarify his words. Whatever the case, even without certainty, Multer senses that this is nothing good. Now that his stomach and a bit of his mana are replenished, The elder can feel it clearly. This forest is far from normal. He wonders if Jia gave the entity something in exchange for the food. But the chief insists that's not the case. Molter doesn't buy it. He argues that the King of Ruin would never do a good deed without expecting something in return. But Jia swears there was no price. It genuinely seemed to be an act of mercy. His grace, as Jia calls him, saw the dire situation the Dark Elves were in and showed them compassion. Hearing this, Elder Molter is infuriated that Jia would refer to the King of Ruin as his grace, and starts to suspect that the leader has fallen under the entity's spell. That's when an argument breaks out between these two pillars of the community. Jia insists they owe the utmost respect to someone who fed their people. In fact, he turns the question back on the elder, asking what he would have done. But even Molter can't answer, so he apologizes. From now on, he declares, as the head of the Maze Ram Dark Elves, he'll personally handle matters with the King of Ruin. After all, Molter has lived for 2 centuries, he's sure he can figure something out. Meanwhile, back with Minogra's founders, Atu scolds her master for blowing through a bunch of mana to feed the Dark Elves, reminding him that they need to start building their own nation. Takuto, a little sheepish, admits that he needs his companion now more than ever. Hearing this, Atu drops her tough act and slips into a weirdly love-struck, submissive mode, as if a single kind word from her master is enough to make her melt completely. Takuto, meanwhile, laments that he just couldn't manage to communicate properly with the Dark Elves. No matter how hard he tried, the words just wouldn't come out. Atu confesses she thought he was just trying to act like a mysterious mastermind who hates long speeches and lets his subordinates handle the details. But the truth is, my friends, the kid is just terrible at communication. He never was in his previous life, and it's not like he was suddenly going to become a master of rhetoric and charisma overnight. In other words, he wasn't quiet to look cool, he was quiet because he's shy as hell. The next day, the Elder Molter asks the young elf leader if he's ready to return to the place where the King of Ruin awaits them. As soon as the elf agrees, the experienced elder gets a bad feeling about it, worried about what that entity might want in return for helping his people. Even though Jia insists he never mentioned any kind of payment, the old elf knows the score. After all, evil beings always expect some kind of reward. Regardless, he understands the Dark Elves need the king's help to survive. Jia agrees, pointing out that even if they left the forest to search for food, they could still come back empty-handed. Speaking of leaving the forest, Molter reminds them that one of their hopes is for the clan to reach the Dark Continent and find a kingdom where they won't be hunted, and that maybe this is their last chance. With that said, both leaders agree on one thing: the fate of their people is in their hands. But what they don't know is that our boy Takuto is spying on this whole conversation thanks to his scout. The scene then changes, where the scout quickly returns to his master to report that the Dark Elves would be arriving soon. Atu, our protag servant, already suspected the elves wouldn't be able to carry all the food in a single trip. Takuto, for his part, points out that having people with different cultures and technologies nearby could easily lead to conflict. In fact, he'd prefer if they just took the rest of the food and got the hell out as fast as possible. But the truth is, he's worried he won't be able to negotiate with the elves because of his communication problem, which could cause misunderstandings down the line. Seeing this, Atu offers to handle the negotiations on her master's behalf, which would also serve to elevate the king's grandeur. He accepts and thanks her. The scene changes once more, and now we see that as night falls, Jia arrives before the King of Ruin, accompanied by the tribe's elder, who introduces himself as Molter Cordal Mazrim. First things first, Molter expresses his gratitude for the king's generosity, and then asks for the honor of learning his great name. Cautiously, Atu looks at the king, who gives a nod of approval. Taking the hint, she introduces him as Ira Takuto, Lord of the Apocalypse and Ruler of Ruin, and demands he be treated as formally as possible, leaving Jia visibly impressed. Atu also introduces herself, and Molter vows to engrave both their names into the very soul of his people. Watching silently, Takuto thinks everything is going smoothly so far. After that, Atu tells the elves they can take the food and leave. Molter then asks how he could repay the King of Ruin for his help, but the elf woman immediately waves it off, insisting they could never offer anything worthy of the king's greatness. Besides, since the Mazrim clan has nothing valuable enough to match such generosity, Atu interprets this as a suspicious attitude, which makes the exchange tense. She questions if the elves are planning something behind all this empty talk. Sensing the tension in the air, Takuto whispers a few things into his servant's ear. She flips out, grumbling that these elves are terrible negotiators and that if they don't leave the king alone, they'll only cause trouble and should be annihilated for it. Raising her voice, Atu declares that their heads would look perfect mounted on pikes. Takuto, meanwhile, tells everyone to calm down, guessing that the Mazrim just want to build a relationship that benefits everyone. So, maybe it's best to accept some form of compensation just to put their minds at ease. With that, Atu turns to the Dark Elves and announces that the king is willing to accept a token of gratitude for his charity. As relief washes over the Mazrim's faces, Takuto realizes the elder must have suspected a catch, considering the King of Ruin's evil alignment. Picking up on these unspoken cues, Atu calls the old man a fool for thinking Ira Takuto is some wicked ghost or malevolent spirit. Setting that aside, since she has no idea what to actually ask for in return, she thinks for a moment and decides it would be good to hear everything the Dark Elves know about the world beyond the forest. Molter offers to share all his knowledge, and Atu demands that the Mazrim clan leave the forest once their pact is fulfilled. Gia is clearly shaken by this demand, and Takuto immediately sees he's much easier to read than the elder. Molter admits that nothing would make his clan happier than being allowed to stay in the forest, but Atu won't allow it. Furthermore, if the Mazrim want to keep the lives that were spared, they must not speak of what happened here. Faced with the weight of this ultimatum, Gia seems ready to protest, but Molter calms him and resumes the negotiations, expressing gratitude for the audience with the king and agreeing to everything Atu laid out. As the Dark Elves depart, Takuto wonders if this is really the right thing to do. After all, if the Mazrim are exiled, they'll likely collapse somewhere along the way. Knowing that exile could very well mean death, the King of Ruin extends his hand and invites the elves to become his subjects. Outraged, Atu asks what the hell the king is thinking. He explains he was considering using the refugee system. After all, Dark Elves aren't inherently good or evil, but if they're accepted as refugees into the civilization Takuto plans to build, and if things work like they did in the game, the elves would eventually become evil like them. Atu agrees it's possible for beings of different evil alignments to coexist, but points out that Dark Elves are nothing like Minogra's main citizens, the homunculi, which could create friction. Takuto admits it's risky, but asks Atu to jog her memory and remember what the homunculi look like, and if she could handle living with only those creatures as citizens. She admits it's impossible to put up with their ugliness and stupidity for all eternity and that it would mess with their minds. Atu turns to the Mazrim and announces her master's intention to soon found a nation. If the elves are willing to become citizens, they'll be protected by the king and promised eternal happiness. Last but not least, Atu tells them the real deal. The Dark Elves will become evil beings. With that, they're free to choose their own fate. But, adding a personal note, Atu assures them their side is a lot more fun than it looks. In the next scene, while walking toward the Dark Elves tribe, Atu kept reminding Takuto to watch his step, since he was barefoot. She pointed out that, although it took some time, the Mazrim had finally agreed to become citizens of Minogra. Even though they hesitated at the idea of becoming evil, deep down, they knew from the start this was their best option. Eventually, the pair arrived at the tribe and were greeted by the people, all kneeling in respect. Some looked genuinely excited at the sight of that mysterious entity, while one elf even fainted after feeling the dark miasma swirling around him up close. Soon after, Takuto was led to a throne, and Atu formally welcomed all the Dark Elves as citizens of Minogra, which was now officially founded. From that moment on, the safety of every member of the Mazrim clan would be protected by the great King of Ruin. Still confused, Gia wondered if that was all that would happen. He'd been told that he and his companions would become evil, but he didn't feel any different. Suddenly, a deep-seated hatred welled up inside him, a rage against those who had hunted, mocked, and exiled his people from their own land. Another elf felt the same, which made her declare that she hated every living being in existence. The same feeling could be seen on the faces of every elf in the tribe. Amid all this, Takuto approached Gia to ask if he was alright, and the Mazrim leader realized that this, too, was a form of happiness, the joy of being cared for. Then, with tears in their eyes, all the elves greeted King Ira Takuto, their enthusiasm so overwhelming that even the king himself had no idea why everyone was so worked up. Meanwhile, Atu simply smiled with pride and satisfaction. A few days after founding the nation, Takuto looked at the map of the continent that Molter had given him and muttered that he was cornered. Atu asked what was going on and, flailing on the floor like a kid throwing a tantrum, the leader complained that their kingdom had the worst possible starting position, as there were already two major nations on the continent. To the east was the Holy Kingdom of Qualia, a human civilization devoted to the holy god Arlos, and to the west, Elna, a kingdom of elves who worship nature. In other words, if either of those nations discovered their evil nation to the south, there wouldn't be anything left but dust, especially since Minogra was just starting out and still incredibly weak. To make matters even worse for our protagonist and his people, these lands were so cursed they didn't have a single natural resource they could harvest. However, it wasn't all a tragedy. They remembered that Minogra had the homunculi as its base population, who, as fertile and happy as they might be, were still dumb and consequently made it impossible to produce any research. But now, for the first time, the nation didn't have to rely solely on them, since the Dark Elves were part of the kingdom and could cover those weaknesses. Speaking of which, Atu's ears twitched. She announced that the elves were back, ready to report on the outside world. Without delay, the tribe's elder met with the King of Ruin, alongside the other elf leader. This time, Gia brought his assistant, Emil, since she was smart and well-versed in legends and the ways of other nations. Turning to plans for the future, Atu revealed that the Mazrim would be assigned to key positions in Minogra's administration. Molter would oversee state affairs, since he could use magic and it was a position of great responsibility. Gia would lead Minogra's warriors, also taking charge of recruiting new forces. Gia enthusiastically accepted the new role and promised that if the king commanded, he would show no mercy to any enemy and would display their impaled corpses as a warning. Hearing this, Takuto nearly crapped his pants, leaving Gia genuinely confused. To smooth things over, Atu explained that Takuto preferred peace, which left Gia kind of bugging out. After all, why the hell would the King of Ruin be a pacifist? Anyway, with everyone's role set, Atu told the elves to get some good rest, and when they were in good health, to start building houses. Seeing that Gia had put his foot in his mouth, Molter expressed his deepest gratitude to the king and insisted that, unlike Gia, who only took pride in his muscles, the elder would prove his worth with wisdom. Gia fired back, promising to show off his own vitality, something an old man like Molter could never match. Unsure what to say, Emil just mentioned that she'd work hard, leading Atu to whisper to Takuto that these people seemed a little obsessed with work. Finally, she asked if she should order the gathering of resources, but Takuto suggested developing the area without destroying the forest. Hearing that, Atu turned to Elder Molter to ask if they could collect wood while keeping parts of the forest intact. The elf assured her they could. Their people had always lived in harmony with nature. Hearing this, Gia was baffled not just by how peaceful these elves could be, but also by the fact that the King of Ruin wanted to protect the flora and fauna, despite being considered evil. But that wasn't all. Takuto declared that his citizens should always be reforesting, though it was clear that the Dark Elves had no idea what that meant. Thinking back to the game's tech tree, Takuto guessed, based on what he'd heard so far, that the people in this world were probably at a technological level somewhere around fortress construction. Atu asked if the Dark Elves were familiar with terms like military magic and the 6 main elements. Molter replied that he knew of the 4 main elements, a basic concept in magic. Emil added that she'd never heard any other nation mention military magic. So Atu realized that this world hadn't reached the level of 6-element magic technology yet and was behind in other areas, too. Setting that aside, the elf explained that reforestation was the practice of planting trees where they'd been harvested in order to maintain the environment. Emil admitted this strategy wasn't part of their tradition, while the elder noted that, in reality, it takes centuries for trees to mature after they've been cut down. Atu goes on to say that reforestation is a kind of technology that requires all the main elements and that this knowledge, in fact, comes from their mighty king Ira Takuto. She makes a point of letting everyone know that their king is 100 times more amazing than anyone could imagine, and Takuto can't help but feel a bit embarrassed by all the praise. Still, Atu insists that their ruler's wisdom covers countless fields and that the people of Minogra are blessed to receive his favor. Emo asks if the apples they were given are also the king's invention, and Atu, without batting an eye, confirms they are, and then casually adds that the grapes are his creation too. Speaking of which, Emo says she planted the seeds of that purple fruit and can't wait to watch them grow. At that moment, Takuto realizes he could use emergency production to create things that don't even exist in the game, like gunpowder, metals, and oil. And as soon as the king realizes this, the nation of Minogra is granted the divine privilege, the ruler's ability to produce anything he knows about, with the mana cost varying based on the item's complexity. The scene changes, and now we see a group of soldiers protecting religious figures in a snow-covered region. One of them comments that he's heard the saint has a special power, though he doesn't really believe it. The other, however, just tells him to wait and see. And as soon as he says that, a horde of goblins attacks the group. The saint steps forward, preparing to punish the invaders for disturbing the peace of the holy kingdom of Qualia. With a single sweep of her staff, she conjures an extraordinary flame that barbecues the monsters, causing the sky to open up and fill the field with beautiful flowers. According to an officer, this power is part of the reason the kingdom of Qualia can keep evil at bay. She buries her enemies in flames and sends them off with flowers. She is one of the 7 great saviors of the continent, Saint Soalina of the Flowered Burials. Beside her, the cardinal announces he's already dispatched the paladins to the nearby villages. The saint, however, brings up the ominous prophecy of an apocalypse in the cursed lands, insisting that paladins should be sent there as well. But the cardinal refuses, saying that showing any interest in the cursed lands is out of the question and that Central Command would never authorize such a mission. Even so, the saint says she'll investigate on her own if she has to, leading the man to remind her she's no longer a simple country girl. Seeing he can't change her mind, he finally agrees to send the paladins under his personal command. With that settled, the cardinal walks away, muttering insults about the country bumpkin saint, while she remains focused only on saving the people of that region. The scene then changes, and over in the cursed lands, Atu rallies the people to get to work and build the nation. Part of that process was building the throne where King Takuto would sit. The elf was so excited she believed Minogra would soon become powerful enough to rule the land and pierce the very heavens. In the midst of this, the elven administrators present themselves to the king to kick off the council meeting and hand the leader a set of garments so he can finally dress like a true king. With that done, Atu announced it was time to discuss domestic policies, though Takuto seemed far more interested in admiring his new little outfit and his throne than in deciding the nation's future. Embarrassed, his assistant decided to first discuss things among themselves and only consult the king on certain key points. As the meeting begins, Molter asks which buildings should be erected. Jiao explains they've already started preparing the land. Atu replies that the first project will be a food production facility. After all, you can't wage war on an empty stomach. Molter wonders if the king couldn't just use his powers to create an endless supply of food. Our dear Atu is offended by the suggestion that their leader should be stuck doing that all the time. Besides, she points out, they'd still have to figure out how to distribute the food as the nation grew. After Molter apologizes, the king's assistant places a strange plant on the table that makes the other elves recoil. She explains it's a meat tree, in other words, one of their civilization's food production facilities, which produces a mysterious meat that tastes like human flesh. Molter mentions that not everyone could handle eating human meat every day, but Atu says they'll only plant those trees to start. She adds that they'll need a hut to manage the tree and a storehouse for the food, and Emil is put in charge of that. At that moment, this devil nicknamed a tree asks them to be nice to it, sending Emil into a pure state of panic. The next topic on the council's agenda was research. In Atu's view, as a small nation, they urgently needed to acquire advanced magical technologies, a sentiment the king shared with enthusiasm. Molter confesses he was also happy to study magic, since it was a passion of his. He asks what kind of magic they'd be researching, and Atu doesn't hesitate, saying it's military magic. She explains that normal magic can only hit dozens of enemies at once, while military magic can decimate armies of thousands, reshape the land, and offer all sorts of strategic advantages. Molter and Jia are amazed that such spells even exist. Takuto assures them it's not a particularly difficult technology, so it should be developed quickly. With that said, Elder Molter enthusiastically takes charge of researching military magic. Last on the agenda was military planning. Jia points out that they first needed to organize an army. Takuto replies that they wouldn't focus on that just yet, while Atu explains that not only do armies not produce anything, they also consume resources. Jia understands but reminds everyone that their current group of warriors isn't enough to protect the king. To make matters worse, Molter reveals that both he and Jia have bounties on their heads. Faced with this situation, King Takuto declares that they will create a hero. Atu loves the idea. The hero might be expensive to produce, but it has virtually no upkeep costs. Jia asks what exactly this hero would be, and the elf explains that in Minogra, there are several heroes who serve the king. All of them are powerful and possess unique abilities, though they're all monsters in their own right. There are various conditions that must be met to summon them, but soon they should be able to call at least one. Besides, as the king reminded everyone, armies are expensive and draw too much attention. Taking that into consideration, creating a hero could be a smart move. And with that decided, they set out to create a hero and give Jia the peace of mind he so desperately needed. After making that decision, Takuto remarks that, honestly, discussing internal policies is actually kind of fun. But leaving that aside, he reflects that they're also collecting mana from their citizens, which means the nation's mana reserves are in good shape. The amount they collect is directly tied to the people's happiness. Therefore, the happier the citizens, the more the nation thrives. The scene then changes once more, and now we go to the Holy Kingdom of Qualia, where a warrior named Lonius has his prayer interrupted by a supposed emergency. He's not happy about Vertil's lack of respect for the sacred place. As Lonius tucks his ring away, Vertil jokes that the man's wedding band must have become a lucky charm. He asks the names of Lonius's wife and daughter, but he's ignored. Vertil insists, explaining that a high-ranking paladin is demanding an answer. Reluctantly, Lonius replies that his wife is named Marcia and his daughter is Mina. Satisfied, his superior notes that they'll be traveling for a few days and jokes that he was planning to tease Lonius if he started calling out his wife's or daughter's name in his sleep. But unbothered by the mockery, Lonius thinks to himself that while this guy is extremely rude and annoying, on the other hand, his skills are fantastic. In any case, Vertil is annoyed to be sent to the Dark Continent, but Lonius explains it's because they need to investigate a revelation Saint Soalina received. Vertil complains that their unit is far too small for something so delicate, since it's just the two of them, and they've been told to fill out the rest of the party with mercenaries. Lonius agrees it's rare for them to investigate outside their borders, so clearly, there must be a reason they forced Vertil to join him just before departure. As they leave, the pair runs into a group of soldiers who salute Chief Lonius. Vertil assumes his partner must have hired these mercenaries and suddenly gets much more motivated. Lonius considers that, despite Vertil's attitude, he's still a high-ranking paladin, which will definitely boost the team's chances of survival. Back in Minogra, things seem to be going smoothly. Takuto watches the whole process unfold, his eyes filled with joy and hope. He's seen his civilization get started in the game countless times before, but now he gets to witness it firsthand, as if it were real life. And that's just incredible. Soon after, he and Atu are taken by Emil to visit the nation's residential area. According to their guide, the Dark Elves are experts at building homes in the treetops, but since they've been prioritizing the meat trees, not many houses have been built yet. At least the food trees are growing well, and the food storehouse should be finished soon. Emil also mentions that, at the Institute of Magical Research, Elder Molter is gathering those with magical talent to kick off new research. Takuto is pleased with his subordinates' initiative and resourcefulness. And most importantly, the Dark Elves, who were once so thin and exhausted, are now full of life. Emil, a little anxious, asks what the king thinks of all this, since they've all been working so hard to repay the mercy he's shown them. Takuto assures her he thinks it's all amazing and says he's happy to welcome the Dark Elves as citizens. And she, realizing she's been recognized for her hard work, starts to cry with joy. After composing herself, she points out that the meat trees are almost ready for harvest, all thanks to the agricultural tools the king provided. With a haunting voice, one of the trees claims its fruit is almost ripe enough to eat, sending shivers down Emel's spine, while Atu, thrilled, celebrates that they've finally secured enough food. Emel then wants to show them the water source she'd mentioned, but on the way, she senses something strange in the forest, and her suspicions are confirmed when they reach the water. Gia and Molter arrive soon after, but Emel reveals that, unfortunately, the water is no longer good. Molter examines the color and agrees, but Atu takes a sip and declares it's perfectly fine. The Dark Elves are taken aback, but she reminds them, this place is known as the Cursed Lands, and this is proof that the area has truly become part of Minogra's domain. Takuto asks the elves to take a deep breath, and as they do, they feel their minds become sharper and their bodies noticeably stronger. Atu says the Cursed Lands benefit evil beings, while harming those who are neutral or good. Hearing this, Gia drinks the water and finds nothing wrong with it. Takuto points out that this conquered territory is perfect for defense, and soon, all of Minogra's land will be the same. Grateful for the king's immense power, Elder Molter notes that the only downside is that this transformation makes it easier for enemies to spot Minogra's territory. Once again, Gia insists they need to form an army. Unfazed, Atu reminds everyone that they'll be creating a hero, to which Molter admits, with some confusion, that he has no idea what that means. And well, sometimes actions speak louder than words, so the elf thought it would be easier to show what she meant. At that moment, magical, shadowy tentacles shoot out from her back, slicing through the trees behind her as if they were razors. After that visceral demonstration, the elf revealed that she herself was a hero and that what they had just seen was nothing compared to what she could do at her peak. In other words, heroes have the power to wipe out entire armies on their own. Takuto explained that heroes only get stronger over time, even if they barely lift a finger. So, as long as they can stay isolated, Atu alone would be enough to defend the nation for now. Still, after his subordinate's little demonstration, the king couldn't help but complain that she didn't need to cut down half the forest just to prove a point. Once again, the sheer power of King Takuto and Thalamacenta left the Dark Elves awestruck, completely won over. They vow to build a palace worthy of their king as soon as possible. Honestly, Takuto didn't much care for the idea of living in a palace, but the Dark Elves, however, were scandalized by the thought. The idea that the supreme ruler would settle for the same standard as his people filled them with guilt. As Takuto scratched his head, his friend pointed out that building a palace would be expensive, but it could also generate resources and would boost the citizens' happiness. With that, Takuto admitted that, once upon a time, he'd actually wanted a floating castle, so maybe having a palace wouldn't be so bad after all. The Dark Elves were fascinated by the idea of a palace soaring through the sky, something that not long ago would have seemed completely impossible. But after everything they'd witnessed, they were starting to believe that, with their king, even a flying city might one day exist. Once more, the elves fell to their knees and swore to serve their lord with all they had, praying for Minogra's eternal prosperity. Our protag, for his part, was visibly embarrassed by all the attention, but since everyone seemed motivated, he encouraged them to keep up the pace and continue building the nation. The scene changes, and we see that while Minogra is growing, the paladins are on their way, and everything points to a clash being inevitable in the future. Meanwhile, after gathering the expedition team, Verdel praises Lonius for managing to round up so many mercenaries, especially considering that most of them are up north, dealing with the northern disturbance. This whole mess started when barbarians suddenly appeared in the northern province of the Holy Empire of Qualia, raiding villages and causing massive damage. The Saint and the Imperial Army were sent to deal with the chaos, but things are still far from under control. And as a mercenary named Bargo cracks a sly smile talking about the situation, Lonius quickly cuts him off, telling him not to act like it's not his problem. But the mercenary just shrugs it off, insisting that either way, it's not his problem. Surprised, Verdel asks if his crew doesn't plan on heading north. Considering the huge payout they're offering, Bargo explains that nobody's willing to risk their necks after rumors confirmed there's a witch involved in the conflict. In any case, Verdel closes the subject, reminding everyone that their path lies south, into the cursed lands, where nobody knows what they'll find. Meanwhile, deep within the cursed lands, a ghostly figure prowls the shadowy forest, its face hidden beneath a hood. As night falls, the group settles in at a tavern. Lonius brings up the witch from earlier, curious if the rumors are true. But the mercenary dismisses it, saying it's just gossip and that people love to blame the chaos up north on some kind of monster. The paladin agrees, calling it ridiculous, especially since the saint herself is on the case. Bargo says the rumor was probably cooked up by heretics, but just as he's about to continue, Verdel tells him to stop. By this point, the paladin is clearly drunk and calls for another round, leading Bargo to ask if he hasn't had enough. Verdel replies, "After tending to the suffering of the people, in your own home, before your family, you may lay aside your sacred vestments." In other words, when the day's work is done, there's nothing wrong with relaxing a little. Lonius, knowing the scriptures inside and out, corrects him, pointing out that the holy god Arlos only meant that we're excused from our sacred duties when we're around family, not that it's an excuse to get wasted. Unfazed, Verdel says he's ready for a good old religious debate. But at that exact moment, the waitress arrives with another mug the size of a bucket, which makes the conversation change course. Bargo, meanwhile, gets back to business. He points out that two paladins are going out of their way to investigate the cursed lands of the Black Continent, and he wants to know what's so important down there. Because if it's something like a witch, he and his men are out. Verdel assures him that's not the case. In fact, it's about dark elves who fled to those lands, and the Qualian authorities are worried they might stir up trouble. Bargo nods, understanding. That race of elf is infamous for assassinations and curses. Lonius adds that they could become a threat if they get stronger in secret. But Verdel tells him not to stress, they're just there to investigate this time. And if things go south, they can just bail, which Bargo is relieved to hear, as bailing seems to be his specialty. But the other paladin questions if that's really how a warrior of God should act, since they swore to lay down their lives to fight evil. His colleague counters that seeking glory isn't always the point, and that sometimes, you have to take one step back to take two steps forward. After all, everyone here has family waiting for them, and that's reason enough to be careful before diving headlong into danger. And I gotta say, I agree with this guy. That said, the paladin finds himself wondering when he became the old drunk who gives everyone advice. But leaving that aside, he raises his mug and proposes a toast to the expedition. With a deep sigh, Lonius clutches his ring and asks the holy god Arlos to watch over them all. Meanwhile, on the Black Continent, our King Takuto gathers the elves for an event that none of them quite understand. He piles up a mountain of fruits from the meat tree and casts a spell over it, slowly transforming the heap into a long-legged insect. Elder Molter is shocked, as he never imagined the king could create new life. Atu takes the chance to give a proud speech about the incomparable power of the King of Ruin, pointing out that this is just a small sample of what he's truly capable of. Therefore, if the people of Minogra remain dedicated and happy, it will awaken the king's full potential. In other words, it's everyone's duty to show their absolute devotion to Master Takuto. When the crowd disperses, our protag seems relieved that the ritual went smoothly. They're surprised at how easy it was to gather the necessary resources. But what's even more important now is that they know they can create new units. Which means next time, they'll be able to attempt a hero summoning, though they'll need to build up more mana first. Still, with two heroes, they'll have much more confidence in their military strength. Excited, Atu asks him who he'll summon first, and without a moment's hesitation he answers, Isla, the Queen of Insects. One of Minogra's proud heroines, capable of strengthening all insect units, turning long-legged insects into frontline fighters, and producing larvae to boost the nation. In short, Isla is invaluable both in battle and in domestic affairs, making her the perfect hero for this early stage. Leaving that aside, and this is clearly the most important strategic issue, Takuto remembers that the other heroes have terrible personalities. Atu agrees, since the rest are a bunch of egotistical maniacs and depraved lunatics, every one of them obsessed with world domination. Takuto clarifies that he's not saying he'll never summon those types, just that he'd rather avoid it for now, as his main priority is to find a little peace. The next day, as night was approaching, the expedition group led by the two paladins of Qualia ran into a hill giant. Lonius expected nothing less from the Black Continent. He ordered the mercenaries to ready their bows, but Verdel took responsibility for this fight, as there was no time to waste. Stepping forward alone, he drew his weapon and began a prayer, channeling the sacred sword art. And while Bargo was visibly confused, Lonius explained that this was Qualia's secret technique, weaving prayers into his swordplay to invoke divine power. Meanwhile, Verdel was attacked by the giant's enormous club but managed to slice the weapon in two with his blessed sword. Lonius added that paladins who received divine power had their physical abilities greatly enhanced. After a series of rapid strikes, Verdel landed a direct blow to the giant's chest, tearing it apart. According to Lonius, for a high-ranking paladin, this level of power was on par with a lesser dragon. In other words, monsters like the one they just faced stood no chance. And when Verdel finished off the enemy, the mercenaries were left speechless. Atu wondered if the king was worried about the neighboring city, since it wasn't part of Qualia, which meant its alignment wasn't necessarily good. Therefore, it would be wise to decide how to handle it, since, being the closest, they'd probably be the first to discover Minogra's existence. Takuto was actually happy they were neutral. If they were good, negotiations would be impossible. But his assistant knew all too well that being optimistic about a potential threat was basically asking for a disaster. And well, speaking of disaster, at that exact moment, the king sensed an armed group approaching the forest. Not wanting to attract attention, he ordered her to drive them away as peacefully as possible. But if that wasn't an option, she was free to do whatever was necessary. The scene changes, and we see that at the entrance to the Cursed Lands, the mercenary group was preparing to enter under the leadership of the two paladins of Qualia. But just as they neared the edge of the forest, a woman appeared. Verdel demanded to know who she was. The young woman introduced herself as a dark elf who had fled to the forest to survive. She asked what brought the paladins of Qualia there, but Verdel refused to reveal their purpose, questioning her presence. She replied simply that she was living with others who had gone through similar hardships. The elf urged them to turn back. Lonius tried to insert himself, insisting they were men recognized by God, but Verdel quickly shut him down. After all, he was the one talking now. The younger paladin insisted he couldn't just turn back and leave, but she pleaded for mercy, explaining that her people were terrified. Seeing how persistent she was, Verdel wondered if there was something hidden in the forest, something she assured him was nothing but peace and quiet. Finally, Verdel lays it all on the line. They were there because of a divine revelation warning of a calamity in the area, and they couldn't leave without confirming what was really going on. Lonius, shocked, reminded him that this was supposed to be a state secret, but Verdel told him to shut his trap once more. However, even after learning about the revelation, the dark elf refused to let the paladins enter. With her crimson eyes glowing, she insisted there was nothing to fear and that the paladins should return to where they came from. Lonius suspected she was using dark magic and became even more convinced there was a calamity nearby. Verdel, on the other hand, seemed to be falling under her spell, almost ready to call off the mission. So, he asked the elf to swear before God that there was nothing wrong with the forest. And when she did, he decided they would leave. Lonius couldn't believe his companion was buying this, but the other paladin truly believed these elves just wanted to live in peace. Lonius insists he can feel the evil energy radiating from her and that there's no way someone like that can be trusted, but his companion reminds him that trust is one of the pillars of their faith. Raising his voice, Verdel yells that there is nothing wrong with this forest and that this is simply the conclusion of their investigation. With that, the man turns to leave. Lonius, who is making me incredibly angry, says that Verdel is abandoning the mission and relieves him of command right then and there. Verdel turns around, demanding to know what he thinks he's doing. The younger paladin argues that he not only revealed the prophecy but is now about to leave without even investigating. From now on, Lonius proclaims, he's taking charge, and the investigation will proceed right now. Bargo responds to the call as if Lonius really is the leader. Verdel reprimands him, but the mercenary chief explains that it's Lonius who's paying his group. The elf pleads with them to reconsider, but Lonius orders his men to restrain her. On the other hand, Verdel commands that no one lay a finger on someone so defenseless. So, realizing her attempts to resolve things peacefully have unfortunately failed, Atu decides she has no alternative and will have to take another approach. And well, in a scene change we see what that other approach was. Lonius wakes up, with blood on his hands. As he takes in the tragedy that unfolded around him, he sees Verdel standing before a witch, the very creature responsible for slaughtering the mercenaries in such a brutal fashion. Atu, for her part, laments that things were going so well, but sadly, not everything in life goes as planned.
Verdel, anxious, tells Bargo to make sure one of the messengers gets back home to report what just happened. But the mercenary replies that's not going to be possible, because Atu simply barbecued all their messengers with a single attack. And as he says this, we see the elf is brimming with confidence. She tells them not to be scared now. After all, she's exactly the kind of monster they were looking for. The soldiers' bodies drop to the ground, and Lonius is petrified with fear. However, Verdel still stands firm and tells them not to lose their cool, because it's either they die now or they fight to the end. With that, he orders everyone to take their combat positions. But our dear Atu doesn't seem the slightest bit intimidated. In fact, she finds this whole thing kind of amusing. Verdel then orders them to fire their arrows, and we see a shower of projectiles fly towards Atu. But she blocks every single one effortlessly with her tentacles, and this shatters the morale of Verdel, Lonius, and the others. Verdel then laments that everything was going so well. Atu agrees, mentioning that when you get down to it, the blame lies solely and exclusively with the bowl-cut idiot, since he was the one who kept up with that bossy and challenging charade. Lonius then questions what a witch like Atu is and what she's capable of. Verdel admits he was instructed to keep that information confidential, but since he thinks he's going to die anyway, it wouldn't make a difference. It turns out that when a saint receives a revelation and the higher-ups confirm it, that monster is then classified as a witch, and he has strong reasons to believe the woman before them is that very same being. Lonius hears the explanation and understands that they're both completely screwed. Atu then asks if they're done catching up on the gossip because she's about to finish them off. Verdel isn't willing to back down and tells the mercenaries to fall back, as he and Lonius will handle this mess. With that, the two of them charge forward with their swords in hand and make contact with Atu's tentacles. She smiles, saying they're much slower and weaker than she expected. However, things take an unexpected turn when they both manage to cut through her tentacles, something Atu herself can't believe just happened. After Lonius and Verdel create some distance, they conclude that their plan will be, first and foremost, to cut off her disgusting tentacles. But Atu doesn't panic. Instead, she strangely starts to caress the tentacle that was cut off. Verdel interrupts this with a strike that cuts off another of her tentacles, and Lonius follows up and cuts another, which makes Atu finally start to sweat. She now has only 2 tentacles left and uses them to take 2 of the paladins hostage, admitting that she might have underestimated them a bit and that they've proven to be much stronger than she thought. She knows full well how much humans care for each other, so she's planning on using these paladins as meat shields, perfectly aware that Verdel and Lonius won't attack. Verdel tells Lonius to keep us cool and think about the bigger picture. If they sacrifice these 2 paladins and defeat her, their victory would mean an end to all of this once and for all. They charge forward simultaneously to deliver the final blow. The elf is shocked to see them willing to attack, knowing it would mean killing 2 of their soldiers. And so they did, running their swords through the soldiers and are about to land a decisive strike. But that's when Atu decides to stop playing around. And as a consequence, we see Lonius open his eyes and find himself still alive on the floor. But as for Verdel, let's just say luck didn't smile on him, Atu did, and he bit the dust. Lonius, seeing this, doesn't understand what's happening because they had already cut off all her tentacles. She informs him that she can regenerate them as much as she wants. In other words, she was literally toying with them from the start. Lonius has no more tricks up his sleeve, so he just tells the other paladins to get out of there as fast as they can, as at least one person has to make it back alive to warn the kingdom. Hearing that order, the paladins bail, and as a last desperate effort, Lonius tries a sneak attack, but she easily blocks it, drawing a sword of her own. Lonius trembles in shock, wondering how she's able to use the sacred sword art. Atu playfully swings the sword around while saying she absorbed both the sword and the techniques from Verdel, and all the effort and techniques he honed became hers the moment she took him out. The elf isn't surprised that Verdel was high-ranking paladin since he was concerned for everyone's safety until his final moment, but it's so sad that he ended up being killed because that blockhead over there couldn't keep his mouth shut. They then exchange a few more blows until the elf asks if he still wants to see his wife, Marcia, and his daughter Mina again. And Lonius almost craps his pants hearing that. After all, how could she know about his family? It's then that he realizes Atu also obtained Verdel's feelings and memories after finishing him off, and consequently she gets stronger after defeating each enemy. Hearing those names, the fear that was already in his eyes becomes absolutely overwhelming. Atu reveals that Verdel thought of his comrade's safety until his last breath, exactly what a paladin, a true hero, should do. But she emphasizes once again that it was all in vain because of the blockhead gentleman's misguided courage and his need to follow stupid rules. Trying not to be shaken, Lonius says that Verdel's will and hope will live on as long as the mercenaries manage to escape, but as soon as he says this, he hears the scream of a mercenary echoing in the distance. The elf reveals she has her own allies and positioned them to prevent any survivors from escaping. At that moment, my friends, whatever hope Lonius had seems to slip through his fingers, leaving only total and absolute despair behind. In the next scene, as the sun begins to set, the elf talks to her opponent about how things could have been different if only Lonius had listened to Verdel. He could have returned to his beloved family, living a quiet and peaceful life. But now it's time to talk about what's really going to happen. The future Lonius chose. The paladin is going to bite the dust, and she warns that his family will too, as she's going to hunt down his wife and daughter, torturing them so mercilessly that both will beg for death. And after that, the elf will visit every village and town they pass through, exterminating every living soul, just because she can. And when people ask why, she'll simply say it's all Lonius's fault. Damn, that's what we call pacifism, huh? Lonius, desperate, tells her to stop, but Atu continues, sharing a lesson she learned from someone precious. When you're underestimated, it will be your end. So when that happens, you kill, no matter what. That's why she'll do what she'll do, precisely to ensure she's never underestimated again. And that it doesn't matter if it's hundreds, thousands, or even millions, she'll wipe them all off the map. And to make it crystal clear, she stresses once more that it's all because of Lonius's decision. As our not-so-dear Atu flashes the smile of a deep-web pacifist, the man starts to cry and begs her not to do it. But she continues, saying she knows Lonius was probably a good man who believed in God and always tried to do the right thing. But that's exactly why she despises those who think they're righteous. And with that, she says goodbye to the paladin and tells him to watch the true meaning of calamity while enjoying his VIP seat up in heaven. Hearing these words, Lonius lets out a scream of despair until finally his physical and psychological torture comes to an end. When it's all over, we see Gia show up and report that the fleeing humans have been taken care of, and the elf then announces she's going back to the forest. However, before she leaves, Gia asks her if she's really going to do all those terrible things she threatened, and she just laughs and says she'd never do that. After all, she's a pacifist. She was just having a little fun teasing him to lighten the mood. And still, she can't waste time. She needs to get back to the king. A joke, yeah, right. She goes to Takuto and reveals that there are witches in this world, a unit that doesn't exist in the original universe of the game Eternal Nations, which means this isn't the world of the game, but some kind of parallel version. Takuto is frustrated knowing this will only complicate Minagraha's plans, but she points out there's an upside. Besides her ability to steal powers, she can now also steal fragments of memories. Takuto, excited, notes this will help them find out what's happening in Qualia without needing a full-blown investigation. The elf reports that Qualia isn't as strong as they thought, thanks to the northern province and a disaster that happened there. Because of that, the king feels that Minagraha has bought a little more time with this stalemate. In other words, this isn't a concern for now. However, what really worries our protag in this whole story is the cause of that disaster. According to the memories Atu stole, it's being attributed to a witch, and apparently this monstrous being is called Irakino, the Devouring Witch. The scene changes and we see who this Irakino is, skipping and humming happily among the rubble and victims of the calamity she herself unleashed, mimicking the tick-tock of a clock. And her plan now is to go to the next city and bring chaos there as well. We return to Minagraha, and Takuto theorizes that this witch might have come to this world the same way they did. But leaving the guesswork aside, they need to focus on the here and now, which means preparing and getting stronger. Because considering this witch is a hero unit, Takuto had initially thought of summoning Ayla, But considering she's a unit better suited for resource production than for combat, and understanding that the scenario has changed with the information they've obtained, the king is considering summoning another hero, that one that's enough to stand up to the witch. Furthermore, Takuto mentions that Ayla isn't the only thing he needs to reconsider. When the elf asks what else, he says he's thinking of forging an alliance, which sends a chill down Atu's spine, activating her suspicious mode. Takuto then explains, saying they have a known enemy in Quoglia, plus the uncertain element that is the witch. Knowing this, he wants to have at least one more nation on their side. Atu says he understands his reasoning, but questions how that could be possible since they are aligned with evil. Takuto replies that it is possible as long as the other side has something to gain, and that it will only work if the nation in question is neutral. Atu, listening intently, asks if he's talking about the nation to the east. Takuto says yes, and that when the palace is ready, he wants to investigate that nation and at the same time strengthen Minograha's forces, to see if they're willing to join forces. Far from all this, we see another scene where a staff bearer orders the elders to be taken down from their pedestal and tells her followers to take care of the bodies. However, it seems things there are far from over, as more enemies appear. She orders the fighters to take a defensive position, and furthermore, she sends messengers to ask for reinforcements. And from the way this story is unfolding, maybe this is the nation that will end up allying with Minograha. After all, wherever there are tears, there will always be someone to sell a handkerchief, right? Since they need reinforcements and Minograha needs allies, this would be the mutual aid that would benefit both. Back to our protag, we see that Atu is worried, as she thinks Takuto might have thought her actions went a bit too far against the paladins.
However, contrary to what she expected, she realizes that the madman in front of her is totally chill, assuring that he would never be offended by anything his assistant did, as all he wants is for her to keep supporting him. And hearing these words, the elf melts and gets emotional, promising that she will stand by the king no matter what happens. At that moment, the episode ends. And now, how will this story continue? Will the witch be an enemy or an ally in the end? How will this story unfold? Let me know in the comments that you want the next part, smash that like and hype button to support the video, and subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss any new parts.